Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
Well, you ready for some classic science fiction? Yeah. But first, you got to listen to me for a little bit. So, queuing up a PowerPoint here, I hope. And then we'll get started. There is no man behind the curtain, or woman. Okay, I guess we should kill some of the light up front. So let's talk about space. Let's talk about the future, and you're going to see a past version of the future in the movie tonight. I got interested in the future of space travel because it seemed like things were happening. The stagnation that we sort of see around us in terms of us going beyond the Earth seems to be overcome by technology and new initiatives. And so I wanted to talk about that. And you know, it starts with something that most Americans were not alive the last time we set foot on the moon. And as you probably know, in Gallup or various polls, about 7 to 9% of the American public don't think we went to the moon, think it was a hoax, another one of the many conspiracy theories we're surrounded by. And as a scientist and an educator, I'm sort of torn on that. On the one hand, you know, it just annoys the hell out of me that people could be so willfully ignorant about probably the greatest technological achievement humans have ever made from the 60s. On the other hand, I'm realistic enough to know that if you made a list of the batshit crazy things that 7 or 8% of Americans believe in, not landing on the moon is right up there with Elvis is still alive and the grassy knoll and just whatever, some big list of things. So don't get all bent out of shape about it. But if you're going to have the conspiracy theory, don't confront an astronaut. So I never condone violence, but Bart Sibrel, this Dutch filmmaker who's 6'5", was hounding Buzz Aldrin for years at conferences saying, you never went to the moon. Don't F with an astronaut, right? Even if he's 5'8", that's an uppercut, you know. And so yes, we did go to the moon. It did happen. But if you're wondering why things are kind of sluggish, just look at this. This is NASA's budget since its foundation in 1959, and the Apollo-era budgets were unsustainable. They were already in reverse before the landing on the moon. And then we got into this little thing called Vietnam, and Johnson was a space supporter, but there wasn't money to go around, so NASA's budget went into reverse. What's a little more discouraging for space fans is that you'll see in the last 20 years, the budget has gone down as a fraction of GNP by a half, from 1% to 0.5%. So NASA's trying to do more with less. So, you know, people are a bit tough on NASA, but that's hard to do good, ambitious, amazing things with less money. NASA has another problem, which is that they only get in the news when they want more money or something went badly wrong. And so that's a little PR problem they have to deal with. Now, so what's the answer to this? Well, the answer to this is all around us in these growing, you're probably just doing your taxes or have done your taxes and you're feeling a little more obviously poor than you were a few weeks ago when you started doing your taxes. Well, if you want to get depressed, realize that there's this surging number of billionaires in the world, and there's a number of them, like Elon Musk, Richard Branson, who spent a good fraction of $1 billion, not chump change, on space travel. So the billionaires of the world collectively are worth $8 trillion. Any small set of them could get together and eclipse NASA's budget. That just puts all this into perspective. And some of these billionaires are young, they made their money in the tech sector, and they are very interested in space. So that is the wave of the future. And to show that it is really happening, 2 years ago in this again, the whole history of the space age, 2 years ago was the first year that most launches were commercial as opposed to government or military. So clearly we're heading into a new era of space where it's being done by corporations, by private sector, by philanthropists, entrepreneurs. And that could lead to things that was going to be hard to predict. I like to make the comparison, since we're doing movies here and people are analogizing space to entertainment and tourism. So I went to the oracle of all information when you're not being subject to fake facts, which is Wikipedia, because you can't find this on NASA's websites. And I plotted the mean cost of a movie and a space mission. And actually, a few years ago, they crossed. So the average movie now costs more than the average Hollywood movie, not indie movie, costs more than the average space mission. And there are outliers here, and you'll see some of the high and low watermarks. But this is pretty interesting. So this analogy with entertainment is not bad. And most people who've done economic models estimate that the revenues of the space tourism industry within a few years will be about $20 billion a year. And that's just what Hollywood takes in box office and for DVDs. So these are completely comparable industries. When I'm making a head-to-head comparison, I kind of like the one on the top right, which is between Kepler and Avatar. So if you just happen to have $400 million burning a hole in your pocket, you can get a really good director, James Cameron, to make a movie about life on an exoworld, or you can make a 1-meter telescope that goes out and finds hundreds of Earth-like planets and does the real thing. They cost the same. And to a scientist, that starts to sound like a pretty good deal. The really fancy super movie by James Cameron, or the mission that will tell us whether we're alone or not in the universe. So that's the situation we're in, and I think the analogy is good enough that I decided scientists can't live well enough alone, so I decided to push the analogy, and I analogized the history of the internet, the thing that's like air, that's like water. We take it for granted. We don't really think about how it got here. But if you look at it, it's very analogous to what's happening in space. So back to the 60s, there was, you won't know, does anybody know who that person is on the lower left? That's a real nerd trivia question. It's J.R. Licklider. So in 1960, working for the RAND Corporation, he wrote a position paper that completely envisaged the wireless internet, everything that's in your smartphone, the cloud, at a time when computers were the size of a small house. Incredible vision of the internet. Then it incubates in the military-industrial complex, and the first internet were being used out of military installations and defense situations. Then it goes into the research arena. We know that the first web browser was developed at CERN, that high-energy physics place. And then in 1995, we have the transition to the commercial sector. And I challenge anyone to cast their mind back to 1995 and predict where we would be now, 22 years later. 1995, 2 grad students at Stanford got together and envisaged search and Google. A company with a weird name called Amazon was founded, and the first internet service providers were created. It's just a generation ago. And of course, now the commercial aspect of the internet completely overwhelms everything else. But important to point out, the R&D on the internet is still driven by government, federally funded research, pushing the boundary of speed and so on. So take that into space travel, and we have the same thing. We have Robert Goddard, 1920, launching this tiny little rocket. The rocket is the little thing at the top of that stand, which traveled 183 yards across a frozen cabbage patch that his Aunt Effie owned. And that was the first rocket flight. You're not going to see Apollo going to the moon from that experiment in 1920. You have the incubation by the military-industrial complex, and some awkward stories in there. Werner von Braun was the head of the Middle Works slave factory in Germany, which built the V-2 bombs, and probably 8,000 slave workers died in that factory, about the same number of my countrymen in Britain who died from the V-2s themselves. Von Braun was spirited back to the US at the end of the war because we wanted his rocket talents. His Nazi record was scrubbed, sanitized, and most Americans never knew of his past. That's just how the sausages get made, people. And so there's the military-industrial complex, but then you have moving into the research arena, Dwight Eisenhower's bold and brave decision as a general to make NASA a civilian agency, open, rather than, and resisting the arguments of all his fellow generals to make it just a military arm of the government. And then we have what I think is going to be analogous to 1995 with the internet. We have the explosion of the private sector space. Maybe not as dramatic as with the internet, but I think it's happening around us as we speak, such that 20 years from now, it'll be hard to see how we got there. We won't be able to imagine it because we're just seeing its beginnings now. And of course, there are visions and dreams, and this is 1970s NASA art envisaging space wheels with artificial gravity and hundreds of thousands of people living in high Earth orbit. And you look at this and you think, well, what were they smoking? And well, it was the 1970s, and yes, they were smoking, even in NASA. And the truth of space is it's a little more mundane than that. And space is about plumbing and electrical work. I got to level with you. Some of you may have seen astronauts giving talks. That's most of what they do. And then there's that whole zero gravity toilet thing, which you just don't want to think too much about. So let's step forward through classic science fiction a little bit, just show a couple of clips. And I'm going to start right at the beginning. Georges Méliès, 1902. It's quaint, it's goofy, it's wonderful. It's the first science fiction movie. So for the 40s and 50s, you know, science fiction was kind of black and white. It was kind of B grade. It was kind of schlocky. I think that was a pretty constant subplot, 4 men and a girl. It just sort of makes you, just think about that for a little while, 4 men and a girl in a spaceship. And then, of course, you have to figure out how to talk to the aliens or the robots. That's a big deal. And as we move forward into the more modern era, you'll notice that space travel will start to get mythologized a little bit. This, of course, familiar to most people in the hands of a master movie maker, Ron Howard. And it's, you know, it's sort of telling a story. In the end, of course, Apollo 13 was, you know, a mission that essentially failed, nearly killed all the astronauts, and just daring do and duct tape saved the day. But in the storytelling, we see this mythic dimension of space travel.
This is it. A few bumps and we're hauling the mail.
We're go for launch. T-minus
15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Ignition sequence start. 1. Ignition. The clock is running. Okay, guys, we got it.
So that really happened. And then, of course, in the last 30 years, we get to live space in this grand tableau, this sort of operatic version of space, which is discordant with what actually is happening in space, where we haven't been back even to the moon, the nearest body in space. There's still only 12 humans that have stood on another world. And yet, in the movie Visions, we're living this large world throughout the galaxy. And this montage will have, I'm sure, all of your favorite movies in it.
So you can settle for less than ordinary life? Or do you feel like you were meant for something better? Something special? Your father was captain of the starship for 12 minutes. He saved 800 lives, including your mother's and yours. I dare you to do better.
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Gravity generated will hold you up.
You gotta trust me on this.
What does it matter if there's nothing left at all?
But space, reassuringly, has now become real in the movies again. So space and space travel have converged into the things that we can do and are about to do. And that, of course, is epitomized by Mars. So let's finish this little tour with Mars on film. So as we know, Mars has two faces. Mars can be beautiful. And yes, Mars can be a bitch. So let's get to tonight's feature. It's a beautiful movie. It's a classic in every way. So I'm not going to talk about it much. It's time to watch it. It's one of the most artistic and artful and colorful movies ever made in science fiction of any era. And it harks back to a different era. And you can see that in some of these stills. You know, you got the robot, you got the girl. And yes, this is a little weird. Don't go there, people. Don't go there. This is 1950s America. There was no sex in America in 1950s, certainly not between a robot and a chick. Although actually I was born then, so there must have been a little sex happening somewhere, but not much. This is the movie we're going to watch, and you'll be pleased to know it's a tomato meter of 98%. It's generally well reviewed, and you're watching a precursor to a lot of stuff that happened in the succeeding half century. You're watching a movie that was the first film to be entirely on another planet. You're watching a movie that has themes from Shakespeare and Freud, so it's a high concept movie. This is the first film with a fully electronic score, so cutting edge in that regard. It was shot on the same sound stage as The Wizard of Oz, and I challenge, the aficionados, you can actually look for those little connections in some of the scenes. It's the first science fiction film cost more than $1 million. It actually cost $2 million, which was real money back in 1956. And it was the inspiration, according to Gene Roddenberry, for Star Trek, and has clear antecedents to Star Wars and all the space opera movies that we know and love for the last 30 years. So time to watch the movie. Thank you.